and unions step in to fill those knowledge gaps? Who do we trust to learn from East Palestine and spare other communities the same fate? No rail transportation system will ever be 100% safe. Transportation of hazardous chemicals will never be without risk. We have to do both, so we have to accept some of that risk and accept we can never fully eliminate it. The question then is whether the risk right now is too high. If so, what would bring it down? The industry's latest data finds that for all railroads, the derailment rate is down 31% since 2000, but despite that longer-term positive trend, it was up by 5% year over year. A fact sheet being circulated by Senator J.D. Vance's office contends, quote, derailments in the United States are much more common than in other countries, and they specifically cite numbers from the EU and from Japan. So while we aren't in an urgent state of national emergency, there is probably more that we can do. Determining whether government regulations would harm or hurt those efforts becomes important here. The fact sheet being circulated by Vance's office makes reasonable arguments for each of the provisions in the bill and makes reasonable rebuttals to legitimate points of contention. I uploaded the full thing over at The Federalist. You can read it there. Again, I'm not an industry expert, nor is Vance, nor are the editors of National Review who came out against the bill this week. But where the bill empowers the Department of Transportation, the measures appear very modest and within the realistic, if imperfect, scope of federal oversight here. The bill's two-person crew requirement is eminently reasonable for obvious reasons, be it mitigation in East Palestine or prevention in other cases. If, as National Review claims, this will stall transition to safer, automated mechanisms, the industry is welcome to explain why it can't pay for those to ensure the interim period is properly staffed. Maybe they could pause some stock buybacks. It's true, also, as NR says, should the bill pass, the railroads would adjust their behavior to any new regulatory burden, unquote. The magazine claims that could come at the cost of safety by pushing hazardous chemicals into trucks. But if the regulatory burden is reasonable, that's not the fault of the government. It's the fault of an industry being subsidized to the tune of billions for putting profit over people. There's a lot going on when it comes to the economics of America's railroads. The right would correctly point out subsidies abound, distorting the true market forces at play. The left would correctly point out the captive shipper problem that essentially gives companies monopoly power. Vance himself has actually noted both of those problems. Others might argue that this is an industry that needs both subsidies and some form of monopolies in order to function at all. Here's where the rubber meets the road. In a report on the NTSB's February findings that an overheated wheel bearing likely caused the derailment, NPR noted, quote, the spacing of hot box detectors and the temperatures at which they trigger alarms are not currently regulated by federal law, officials say. Norfolk Southern and its crew appear to have actually followed all of the regulations. So both the market and the government failed here. Norfolk Southern has no incentive to get months of bad PR, and the government has no incentive to take a beating from the public. But if an industry we all agree has safety implications that demand some government oversight, needs better oversight, if it's cutting staff to maximize profits over safety, this is not a lemonade stand. It's a subsidized industry that handles life and death situations on a daily basis across the entire country. Hot boxes and crew mandates aren't going to kill its efficiency. It boggles the mind that establishment Republicans trust the business executives who spent years ratcheting up cultural tensions by devoting vast resources to stupid virtue signals like Norfolk Southern or even Silicon Valley Bank. At best, they're surprisingly incompetent, and that's just at best. With PSR and the labor negotiations last fall, the industry has already shown an interest in profits over people and over safety. So earlier this month, Republican Senator John Thune said of the bill, we'll take a look at what's being proposed, but an immediate quick response heavy on regulation needs to be thoughtful and targeted. Tragedies are often exploited by special interests. They abuse the emotions and anger of the public to ram through bad legislation, creating a false sense of catharsis. Tragedies also induce calls for action, for lawmakers to do something, anything to help. Again, this well-placed anger can create unintended consequences. Adding new layers of government control is sometimes easy because big business has money, lobbying money, to craft the regulation in their favor, especially over smaller competitors. For more on that, I really recommend Tim Carney's book, The Big Ripoff. But none of this means government can't do better where oversight is actually warranted, where it actually has a duty to check big business. The Vance bill might not be perfect right now. Even great bills aren't perfect when they're introduced. But Thune's standard of thoughtful and targeted measures appears to be much more accurate as a description of this case than the industry's claims otherwise.
Today, we're going to pick up where we left off last week, exploring the origin of the Ebola outbreak in 2014. And we're going to be joined by two authors of a fascinating article published in Independent Science News, if we can put that up there. And so this is Jonathan Latham. He's the editor of Independent Science News, and he's executive director of the Bioscience Resource Project. The article was co-authored by Sam Husseini, who is a journalist on Substack and elsewhere, and was the co-author of this story. Happy to welcome them both to Counterpoints today. Sam, Dr. Latham, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start out, as we did last week, by playing a clip from a podcast that included virologist Christian Anderson attempting to kind of debunk a conspiracy theory, but in the process making a fascinating admission, if we could roll that.
Problem is that people see these coincidences. One of the new ones is the Ebola lab leak, which also is being blamed on us because we have been studying Ebola in Kenema in Sierra Leone, and lo and behold, Ebola emerged just a few miles from there in 2014, right? Obviously across the border in Guinea, but it's maybe 100 miles or so away. And people then put that together and say, oh, so that Ebola must have been a lab leak too, and it was Robert Gary and Christian Anderson again. And the reason why these names keep coming up and the reason why we get grant money to study infectious diseases is because we study infectious diseases and have done so for many, many decades. And that's why the names keep coming up again, right? It's not because there's some major conspiracy theory here where all of us have been sort of fiddling with the fields well prior to the pandemic.
And so, Sam, the mainstream media's initial story of the outbreak of Ebola was that in Guinea, a 2-year-old child was playing with bats. And then several months later, you wound up with an Ebola outbreak. What to you was so important from that interview that Dr. Anderson gave?
Well, my suspicions predated his recent statements, obviously, but it's remarkable that he would be saying this at this point. They have been denying that they were working on Ebola this entire time. In their prior statements, Gary wrote an article, his co-partner as head of the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium. These are the labs in West Africa that Africans claimed might have been the source of the 2014 Ebola outbreak. He recently denied it in an article. So for Anderson now to be seeming to admit in a very interesting and curious way that they were in fact working on Ebola is, I think, potentially an incredibly significant development. But the case against their narrative that it, effectively pinning this on he wasn't even 2 years old, he was 18 months old. This was over 1,000 miles away from prior Ebola outbreaks. In prior Ebola outbreaks, there was always a die-off of the local mammalian species. There was no such die-off of local mammalian species. They even acknowledged that. Fabian Linders, who wrote the sort of what we would call the cover story, and who was also part of the Wuhan Institute of Virology investigation by the World Health Organization. They acknowledged in their article that there were no bats that they could find in the village that they claim where the outbreak started, and they also acknowledged that there was no die-off of the mammalian species. So there are an incredible number of holes in their dominant narrative, and the closer you look at this, the more it points to a concerted effort to effectively frame Guinea. That is, this happened in 3 countries, and there's a whole series of patterns in which they seem to have tried to pin this on Guinea just over the border from Sierra Leone to get it away from where the U.S. lies.
What does the evidence, as far as we know, say about where the most likely origin was?
Well, I mean, the balance of evidence, I would say, favors Guinea, but there are some open questions about the provenance of some of the samples that were taken. So, for example, during the outbreak, at the very beginning, MSF, Doctors Without Borders, alleged that they were the people who identified the very first confirmed cases. But what they argued was that those confirmed cases were in fact coming from across the border in Sierra Leone. And if you look at the phylogenetic research that has been used to pin the outbreak on Guinea, what you see is that some of the very earliest cases that are pinned on Guinea are probably actually from an outbreak in Sierra Leone. And so if you undo that misattribution, as it were, then what you come up with is almost certainly an origin in Sierra Leone.
And did it start earlier than has been publicly claimed, the epidemic that is, or do we have evidence of that at this point?
Well, the official start of the outbreak is the first diagnosed cases on March the 17th. But what the people in Sierra Leone identified was a start on May 25th. So this is 2 months later. And but what they found when they first started identifying cases is that these cases were many mutations different from each other, which implies that there had been an outbreak in Sierra Leone long before. But we don't know if there was an outbreak in Guinea long before. That is the allegation of Fabian Leendertz and the paper that essentially found nothing in Guinea when they went to look at the purported outbreak site. So the claim of Leendertz is that the outbreak started in December with the death of this young child. But there is essentially no evidence for that. So the child doesn't have a confirmed diagnosis. None of his contacts has a confirmed diagnosis. There's no confirmed diagnosis for almost 3 months after that. So for the scientific community to allege that is the first date of the outbreak is frankly ridiculous.
What else, Sam? What else could that child have died of? Like they say it was Ebola. What else could it have been?
His father thinks that he died of malaria, and his father didn't get anything. The healthcare workers in the village didn't get anything. His mother did also die, but that was apparently potentially for treatment that she got from Ebola. She was pregnant at the time, so she was in a particularly vulnerable state. I don't know if Jonathan could have more ideas on that.
Yeah, Jonathan, do you have? Go ahead.
No, I mean, not a great deal to add, except that there are some suggestions that she might have had cholera too. But at the time, there was no suggestion that she had Ebola virus. And obviously, people who have miscarriages, viral hemorrhagic fevers are diseases associated with loss of blood. But obviously, so are miscarriages. And so she died along with her child. And so there's no real reason to think, so far as I can see, that she had Ebola, because it can be misdiagnosed so easily. I mean, basically the only way that anybody considers that you can confidently diagnose Ebola is with a lab test. And no lab tests were done until the middle of March.
And why, Sam, what do we know about this lab that was in Sierra Leone? And why would there be this 2-month period in which it seems as if Ebola is circulating, but it's not getting picked up?
I'll let Jonathan speak to the second point, but this lab is headed by Robert Garrity and Christian Anderson. Those names might ring a bell with people because they are the authors, the two primary authors of the Proximal Origins paper, which came out in the spring of 2020 and asserted that COVID could not be a laboratory construct. It's very difficult to overstate the importance of this article. It really set the tone for the dominant mainstream media coverage of COVID, that it couldn't possibly come out of a lab, and you were a nut job to think that it could possibly come out of a lab. So they had a massive conflict of interest to dismiss the possibility of lab origin, because the next question would be, if the global public, imagine if the global public understood in early 2020 that this plague ravaging through the world could have come out of a lab, one of the next major questions would have been, what about prior outbreaks? And as a matter of fact, I asked in February of 2020, the CDC, if COVID could have come out of a lab, and their response was well, disingenuous. And then when I followed up and I pushed, they said, well, we got to be careful about what kind of information we put out here, because remember what happened with the Ebola in 2014, and we had to, dismiss the possibility of a lab origin then in order to have people deal with the disease, which was a very weird way to put it. So that's a major thing that we have to keep in mind. There are all kinds of U.S. institutions that are involved with this viral hemorrhagic fever consortium, and the work done there was increasingly done on dangerous viruses, particularly after, people might remember the anthrax attacks of 2002. Chernobyl emphasizes this, Sierra Leonean journalists, that there was a spike in that activity and massive funding for work on dangerous viruses and pathogens during that period. So we know that it was working on deadly pathogens, and we know that they had safety issues. There were statements by some of the scientists there saying, we can get so much work done here than we could in the United States because the safety concerns are not as onerous from their point of view. They don't have to be in a BSL-4 lab and be in a spacesuit kind of thing. So from their point of view, it's so much easier to do this kind of dangerous lab work.
Not cost-free. Yeah, Jonathan, to that second point, how would you have a 2-month outbreak in Sierra Leone that doesn't get picked up? And what was MSF's response to that?
Well, the simple answer to the first part is that the beginning of an outbreak, there are not very many cases typically. So an Ebola doesn't transmit that easily. So it would be possible to miss it in between that and the problems with diagnosing Ebola, which especially in its early stages looks like many other illnesses, like we've heard about malaria and cholera. But this is an area of West Africa that is in which Lassa fever is endemic. So that's another disease that can be misattributed in this case. So you have all these possible confusions, and what MSF discovered when they went to the lab, and also the World Health Organization. So a series of organizations went to the lab after the outbreak started. This is the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium lab in Kenema, in Sierra Leone. And they went there and they discovered all kinds of biosecurity breaches. There were allegations of needles all over the floor, that they didn't have UV decontamination procedures in place, and that samples were reagents were being reused and so forth. And we know that there was confusions. There was a group, there's a company called Metabiota, and there's a Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium that were basically operating the same premises, but essentially ended up in conflict with each other. And this conflict seems to have started in confusion. But there's also the possibility that, exactly like COVID, that there is a great benefit to anybody who leaks a lab to confuse the data around the origins, because then it becomes impossible to reestablish what actually were the chains of the contact chains and the dates of diagnoses and so forth of the people who first get the illness.
And I want to move to the COVID origin discussion next, but real quickly, where should people go if they want to learn more about this?
Our main article is on Independent Science News, which Jonathan's the editor of. I've been doing a series of smaller follow-ups on my Substack, husseini.substack.com. Just to put a fine point on what Jonathan said, when Doctors Without Borders finally got to Sierra Leone, they talked about a quote-unquote hidden epidemic.
That's in one of the reports they published.
Correct.
At the time.
Because they were startled by the number of cases there, and they attributed this to bungling by Metabiota, which, as people might realize, has been in the news in other contexts. But that's one interpretation, that it could have been bungling. It could also have been part of a concerted effort to draw attention away from Sierra Leone and effectively frame Guinea. Undercount the cases in Sierra Leone, away where the U.S. labs are, so that you can say the outbreak started in Guinea and pin it all on this toddler in an African village.
Right. And so moving on to the latest news on the COVID origins, we can put up this, I think it's R6. This is the preprint that kicked off so much news coverage over the past week, beginning in the Atlantic, based on some interviews actually with Christian Anderson, who we were just speaking of, Robert Gary and others. Those are authors now of this preprint. The New York Times did 2 major pieces off of this.
They got great
off of
publicists, these guys do.
And so
But you know, that's the thing. I don't think they have publicists. I think they just have direct lines.
direct access, right?
I don't think
It's
they
the
do.
credibility factor.
You're totally right. I'm kidding.
Right.
They'll just swallow it, you know?
And so we're still joined by Dr. Jonathan Latham, virologist and the publisher editor of Independent Science News, Sam Husseini, reporter who writes on the Substack, husseini.substack.com. Thank you again, guys, for joining us. And so I'll start with you, Dr. Latham. So now that we've had this entire news cycle, as the cycle dies down, now we get the preprint, which, to be clear, for non-scientists, including myself, is not a peer-reviewed paper. But at least it is something that is written down on paper. And so as you've digested this preprint, how does it match up with the New York Times and Atlantic headlines that were so definitive in saying we can now link the origins of COVID to a raccoon dog in the Wuhan market?
So, I mean, right now, what we get to see is how weak the underlying data is, right? And the fundamental issue is that they find raccoon dog DNA, but they also find many other kinds of DNA. None of the raccoon dog DNA demonstrates that the raccoon dog was infected with a virus. This is an animal market where raccoon dogs are for sale. So finding raccoon dog DNA is a little bit unsurprising. But what the data shows is that SARS-CoV-2 RNA nucleotide sequences were basically all over the market. But the fundamental point for me is that the dating of this is all wrong, right? We know that the outbreak almost certainly started in September or October, and maybe even earlier than that. That is approximately the consensus. We know that there were people sick in Italy, for example. There are samples from Italy in November. So we know that the outbreak started months before these samples were taken. Therefore, these samples are irrelevant to the beginning of the outbreak. And I would say that the Huanan market was not, there's no evidence even that the Huanan market was a super spreader event. It may simply have been representative of Wuhan city at that time, when there were thousands of cases of COVID in the city.
And it's really obviously hard for a journalist in January, February, March of 2020 to know what questions to ask, to ask that questions about the samples and the timing and all of that. That doesn't excuse them not asking those questions. And Sam, I'll toss this question to you. You may both have thoughts on it. Whether we're talking about Ebola or COVID, the publicist thing is kind of funny because it's funny, but it's sad because it's so true that when people come with a preprint, put it in the media, and give it their spin, reporters are susceptible to just swallowing that spin and running with it. So when you look at this preprint now, when you look at how the media reports on difficult subjects like these, what disconnect do you see between the inability then of the press without medical expertise to translate that into information the public needs?
I don't think that the public and the press should have this deferential, this appeal to authority. Mm-hmm. Science, like journalism, is about observing the world and using reason to draw conclusions. It's a fairly simple proposition to say there's a lab nearby. Could that have something to do with it? And then when their response is, oh, people thought the same thing when this other outbreak happened when there was a lab nearby, the logical conclusion would be, okay, so you're telling me there's another case.
Right, yeah.
So maybe that's the issue. that would be the reasonable way to look at it. But the establishment scientific community and the sort of Jon Stewart line that somehow science is the problem, that curiosity will kill us all, That's wrong too, because as I've looked at, for example, Peter Daszak, who funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology, dangerous lab work, the funding base for this is largely from the Pentagon and from USAID. This militarized view, way of looking at things has perverted science. And you had scientists speaking up about this. I mentioned the anthrax attacks earlier. In 2005, there was a letter of 700 scientists saying you're perverting our field to the NIH, saying you're putting so much money, studying these dangerous pathogens, you're messing up with our field. It's no longer becoming a scientific inquiry. And it was Fauci who told them to put up or shut up. The government has told us that they want this work done. This is what we're going to do. So science isn't the problem. The problem is a militarized view of science. And in terms of the recent report, this isn't the first. There have been a series of these highly publicized reports saying, "Oh, yeah, it didn't come out of a lab."
The Nature article.
And
a year ago. Roughly.
Yeah, there was one in August of last year, right before Jeffrey Sachs flipped on this. I think the net effect of that is just to confuse the public. That is, insiders are like, these guys are really burning their credibility, right? But it's the net effect of it is to confuse the public mind so that the public doesn't demand answers, that the public thinks that this is, maybe it's nothing after all.
Muddy the waters.
Totally muddy the waters. And it really reminds me of after, 20th anniversary after the Iraq War. After the Iraq invasion, people might recall there was a series of stories where they claimed to have found the WMDs that all ended up falling apart. Why did they do that? They did that to muddy the waters so that there was never a moment of reckoning. And I think that that's what a lot of these scientists are really hoping, that there's never a moment of reckoning.
Yeah, and Dr. Latham, all of these reports that we're talking about tend to be driven by roughly, it seems like, half a dozen kind of key virologists. And I saw a biologist saying on social media the other day that he felt like he was able to engage in this conversation in a more open and dispassionate way because he's not.
Hunter shows up, he's like the dick.
Isn't that weird that that's the case, but it's not the case with fishermen?
Yeah.
When someone's fishing, it's always a happy thing. Hi, fishing, just casting the fish. Isn't that interesting?
I don't know why that is, man.
Especially fly fishing. That's a gentleman. Like, you never think of, like, a fly fisherman being an asshole.
Well, it's all catch and release. That's their argument, I guess.
But it isn't always.
No.
I mean, it's only catch and release in certain places.
Yeah, certain.
The catch and release thing is odd. I don't really enjoy it.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done it, but I'm always like, what are we doing? We're just fucking with these fish. We're just fucking with these fish, and we're trying to get, like, this weird little charge out of catching them.
You know what's wild, man? Because since I sold my business, Joe, like, I literally go fishing with my kids almost every other day.
So are you retired now?
Nah, well, dude, I don't. I'm
taking some time off.
I'm working on. Well, I'm taking some time off, but I've actually been trying to crank on the YouTube deal, and really get that.
You put up some really good content and very informative.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it,
It's
man.
really good stuff.
So that's kind of like my focus, and I got some ideas that I'm gonna continue to work on that front. But
Do you want some more coffee?
No, I'm good, man. I'm good. As a matter of fact, I need to work on this a little bit.
Probably cold as fuck by now.
Well, the thing is, I was. My wife actually warned me before coming on here. She said, "Don't drink a bunch of coffee because you talk too fast."
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. She's giving you advice. That's so funny.
But it was good advice, so I'll take it. I'll take it from her.
That's hilarious.
But anyways, man, I lost my. Oh yeah, I was telling you.
Informative YouTube stuff. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So the YouTube stuff is one of my focuses, but this kind of period of time is giving me some time to go fishing. I go fishing with my kids like every other morning.
Where are you living these days?
I'm living. Well, so I've been in Puerto Rico the last 4 or 5 months. I got a brother who lives there, so I've been down there, working on my stuff, but doing
Puerto
fishing.
Rico, huh?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I know some people that live down there. It's a good place to avoid taxes.
for some folks. But it's also, my time spent there, Joe. It actually, Puerto Rico is an interesting place. Like the whole legal structure of the place is interesting. But actually, from an outdoorsman perspective, it has all this, to me at least, all this untapped stuff. But the problem is I'm like that from that one kids cartoon, where the dog sees a squirrel and it's like, squirrel. With outdoor stuff, I'm like that, man. So I'm like, oh, tarpon fishes, die! And then spear fishing, so I tend to get drawn every way. But when I'm there, I'm like, dude, there's so many cool outdoor stuff to do there. I have a home there, but we were only going to stay there a couple months. We homeschool our kids, and now we've been there for 6 months, But anyways, back to the fishing part of it, man. I didn't mean to get sidetracked. Is what's crazy with the catch and release thing, my little boy, he cannot believe that we would release anything.
Right, because it's not normal.
Yeah, he looks at your reaction to people's his reaction too. A lot of times, and we keep a lot of them, little snappers and stuff. They cook them. They like to do the whole process. But he cannot believe, man. I'm like, all right, we got to turn this one back, and he's like, why?
What are you talking about, Dad?
And then he tries to negotiate with me, and he's like right before I put it back, he'll be like, Dad, can we use it for bait?
That's hilarious. That's hilarious. Well, I think it's just normal human instincts, right?
Yeah. It's well, we're doing this. We're doing
What is
this
the point?
Yeah.
What are we out here for? Are you just fucking with these fish?
Yeah.
Which is basically what fly fishermen are doing.
Right.
The barbless hooks. They're just out there fucking with fish.
Dude, I've heard you talk about it on this podcast, man. They're all after that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
There's that jiggle
primal feeling. Yeah.
Jiggle from a fish, man. But
if you could sneak up on people and shoot them with a suction cup, people would do it.
Probably.
Yeah, if you knew you could just I got you, bitch.
Yeah.
And no one gets hurt. It's what people like.
Do you feel like you get that from that